do want to bring in Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who is Israel's Special Envoy for Trade and Innovation, as well as the former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem. Fleur, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Good morning.
I do want to start with how likely another ground assault in Khan Younis is.
Well, at the moment, there have been notices of evacuation from citizens, civilians in East Khan Younis to go to humanitarian zones. Again, these are the measures that Israel takes in order for innocent civilians not to get in the way of a war that we didn't start, but we had no choice but to fight. And the reason why we're going back into Khan Younis is because there's a rockets factory there, and yesterday and the day before there was a barrage of rockets coming into southern Israel. So again, the headlines will always talk about the fact that Israel is doing another ground offensive, but what nobody talks about is the backstory that a bunch of rockets have been fired from Khan Younis, and we know indeed that there's a rocket factory there.
And that was actually going to be my next question, is what is prompting this likely invasion? And on top of that, we have seen Hamas regrouping in areas that were previously cleared, a very major concern for Israelis military. Is that also part of this? You had mentioned the factory, but is that another concern? Is that Hamas is continuing to regroup in areas that were previously cleared, causing security concerns?
Absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. And that's why when Israel is negotiating in good faith through the United States and through Qatar about a ceasefire, we are very well aware that part of that has to mean that these terrorists don't go back to these areas that are supposedly terrorist-free. But it's like playing a game of whack-a-mole, because they have 700 kilometers of tunnels and this huge underground subterranean network. They can pop up at any given moment. And this is really the harsh terrain that Israel is having to fight this war. Absolutely.
And I do want to ask, because you brought up the issue of a ceasefire that has not happened yet, but the question being, and you mentioned acting in good faith, can one actually act in good faith with a terrorist group who might be lying? I mean, they might agree to a ceasefire, but then they might actually be, making other activities, onto the side. So when it comes to a ceasefire deal with a terrorist group, can that actually happen?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not sure it can. Of course, we would demand international guarantees. The most important thing for us is getting our hostages home. There's still 100 hostages there, amongst them babies and elderly people and women who we know and understand are being treated in terrible, terrible conditions. And so that's really Israel's main motivation, to get our innocent civilians that were robbed from their homes, from a music festival, back here. And when you talk about good faith, there's zero good faith on the other side. It's a very unparalleled, because Israel plays by the rules of war, and then you're dealing with terrorists who don't play by any rules, and in fact, use their own civilian population as part of their defense strategy, as part of a way to get the world to pressurize Israel. They're not protecting their civilian population. If they were, they would let them go and take shelter in the very many, many miles of tunnels that they have. But that's the last thing they want. They want to sacrifice their people for their crazy death cult ideology.
We have seen mounting pressure, not just from the international community, but also from Israeli citizens and the families whose loved ones still remain hostages. We've seen some very daring rescues that Israeli military have successfully carried out to rescue hostages. What are the next steps that are happening? I imagine some of those operations will continue in the future, but barring a ceasefire negotiation where hostages are exchanged, how can Israel safely bring these hostages home?
Well, the military, I guess everybody understands that the majority of the hostages are not overground. Overground operations are something that you can do. We saw how four hostages were rescued a month ago. When you're talking about subterranean warfare, and they are being hidden and possibly also protecting or used for the protection of Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas, who started October 7th, and who was the mastermind behind this war and, of course, the start of this war, which were the massacres, it's very difficult to be able to rescue those hostages without a deal. And so we have already offered 6 different deals to Hamas, and they have rejected every single deal. You have Antony Blinken saying that the intransigence, the rejection of the deal is coming from Hamas's side. And so at the moment, we're just waiting and praying that Hamas is put under military pressure to make a deal, because that's the only way they're going to acquiesce.
And I do want to ask you this, because we are continuing also to follow some breaking news after an Israeli strike killed at least 9 people in southern Gaza, which is Khan Younis, following those mass evacuations. I do want to ask you that because, as you were mentioning, Israel wants to minimize the loss of innocent lives. But when you're also in a conflict, in a war with a terrorist group who uses civilians as human shields, that is a very difficult balance to strike.
It's almost impossible, but even with those odds, first of all, when you hear 9 people have died, the Gaza so-called health ministry will never say whether they're innocent or combatants. They don't want to make that separation. And we know that our innocent to combatant rates in this war are the best that any conflict in the last 100 years, certainly much better than the Allied forces getting rid of ISIS in Iraq and in other parts of the Middle East. So we know that all our efforts are creating a situation where we're keeping the civilian casualties down to something that no other country has managed to do. And we have, a ton of lawyers in our army, and every single strike is analyzed legally to ensure that it's proportional and it's a fair strike. So again, when you hear 9 people are dead, you're never going to hear from the Gaza Health Ministry they were terrorists. But the proportion of terrorists per innocent civilian that we know is happening is something unprecedented, and that is because of our great efforts. Again, we are putting all the efforts into getting civilians out of harm's way. This is why we ask them to move to humanitarian zones. And Hamas are not only killing and shooting their own people, but they're also making sure that they're in harm's way by hiding underneath civilian areas and even hiding in humanitarian zones.
As there are concerns that Hamas is regrouping in previously cleared areas, what does this mean for Israeli war efforts? We've been hearing from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who had hoped to scale back the full-scale operations, still keep troops there to monitor the situation. But what does this latest mass evacuation indicate, if anything, in regards to the ongoing war efforts?
This is not simple. And again, it's because of these 700 kilometers of tunnels. Imagine there's a whole city under there, which are also terror bases, which is where the terrorists are hiding. And 700 kilometers network under a city is huge. It's bigger than the New York subway. And so these are conditions, these are urban conditions that are almost unprecedented. And so it's not so simple. Nothing is simple. We saw in other areas of Gaza that we cleared out the areas, and then, of course, terrorists came up from underground. And this is the war that we're facing and the war that we need to win. And the West has to help us win this war, because otherwise this is setting a precedent, a very dangerous precedent for terrorists to do this kind of warfare, not just in Israel, but in the rest of the Middle East and the world.
And the conflict that Israel is having with Hamas isn't the only conflict that Israel is involved with. We have seen increased attacks with Hezbollah. And, I wanted to ask you about that, because that's another area of very grave concern, not just in the Middle East, but truly globally.
It's a huge area of concern, mainly because Hezbollah is much, much, much stronger. They have 10 times, 15, 20 times the rockets and the weapons that Hamas have. They have almost more stock than another small country. Hezbollah have taken over the country of Lebanon, and we have been engaged in a low-grade warfare with Hezbollah since the 8th of October. People talking about an impending war. We're already at war. We have 60,000 Israelis who've been displaced from their northern communities, anywhere 10 kilometers from the Lebanese border. We have Hezbollah in contravention of UN resolutions where they're supposed to stay behind the Litani River because of the last war that we fought with them. And so that is of grave concern because, of course, when you fight Hezbollah, you are fighting a proxy war with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the Islamic Republic of Iran have huge ambitions. It only starts with Israel. And again, this would be a proxy war, as far as they're concerned, between Iran and the United States of America, between evil and good, between an ideology of jihadi Islamic extremism versus the free world. All of this happening, Hezbollah versus Israel. And that is what people have to understand. There's a much bigger picture here.
And Fleur, is there anything else particularly that you would want to let our viewers know about as Israel is now facing several conflicts and all eyes are on this region, but it's not just isolated, as you mentioned, to this region of the world. There are global ripple effects.
Absolutely. We're fighting a multi-front war. One front, of course, is Hamas. Another one is the North Hezbollah. Our country is under existential attack. And then on top of all that, we have to fight the information war, the war that somehow the world has turned upside down, and the country of democracy and freedom has become a country which is persecuted in the public discourse. And so we are in a very difficult position, and we need right-minded people. We need people who understand what freedom actually is to stand on the right side of history here.
Fleur, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox. We appreciate your expertise.
Thank you.
I'm Stephanie.